Yesterday was Halloween, and you can see I have my Halloween costume on here, my little kitty earrings with the black hat on the top of it. There you go. All right. So this was all the energy we had for Halloween costumes in our house this year. But it was Halloween, and very many cultures in very many places and very many religious systems have a special thing that they all believe happens right around this time of the year. One of the things that people believe happens around this time of year is that we are in a thin place. We are cosmically in a thin place. We are in a place where the barriers between this world and the next, where the barriers between us and God are more thin than they normally are. There's a couple of different kinds of thin places, but one of the major ones is times when we are willing to acknowledge and talk about life and death in a very serious way. And so some of you may know lots of traditions from lots of cultures around this time of year. And Halloween and the way that we celebrate Halloween is no exception. And what I want to invite us into thinking about this year is the ways that as we move from the celebration of Halloween to the celebration of All Saints' Day, what happens in that transition point? What happens in the ways that we move from one place to another place? And how do the people who move from one place to another place show up for us? You might remember in the sermon last week, we talked a whole lot about how God shows up for us. Today, I want to invite us into some ways of thinking about how do the saints that have gone before us show up for us? How do the people who have passed away show up for us in our lives and in our life of faith? And then how do we move from a place of deep and overwhelming grief and fear, like maybe on Halloween, to the place of All Saints' Day, where we celebrate and we remember and we honor the gift of the saints? And so I want to get at this by telling you some stories. Many of you may remember that my dad passed away from cancer 16 years ago. He was 54 years old. It was a month before Peter and I got married. I was 25. My sister was 22, and our youngest sister was 18. And it was a complicated time for us. And so I will tell you in a little bit about how the book of Revelation is the thing that got me through my father's death. But before that, I want to tell you a story about my parents. My parents were church people. My parents were the super volunteer church people. So my mom organized the church library, and she was on Altar Guild, and she taught Sunday school, and she made centerpieces for any dinners that we had at church, which she still does at her current church today. She puts together craft projects for different groups. I remember I feel like we spent half of our Saturdays at church growing up at church, like cleaning the pews or relighting the eternal flame or organizing the library or helping clean things up. They were these very committed, super church volunteers. And one of the things that we did growing up was we went to church every single Sunday. And one of the ways that we could have potentially known that I was destined to grow up and become a pastor is that as soon as I was old enough to read, around 6, 7, I wanted to follow the liturgy. I grew up in a church that was a little bit old school. And so you might remember, if you've been around Lutheran churches for a long time, right now we have hymnals that are technically cranberry colored hymnals. Before cranberry colored hymnals, there was a hymnal published in 1979 that was green. And before that, there was an old red hymnal that was published in the 50s. And I grew up where we did a thing where we sometimes used the green one and sometimes used the red one, the really old red one, not the cranberry one we have now. That just came out in 2007. And I had all of these signals with my dad so that he could help me follow the liturgy. Because when I was, say, 7, it's really hard to pay attention and to follow on a page. So we had this symbol where I would drag my finger back and forth like this across the page, and he would know that I was lost, and he should point me to where we were in the liturgy. If we were singing a song and I couldn't figure out what line we were on, I would pick up my dad's finger and make him put it on the page so that he would follow the lines along with me so that I could keep track of it. By the time that I was 9 years old, I was very good at reading and public speaking. And so my dad trained me into being a lector. So he would sign up to be lector on the days that there were very short second lessons like today. And he would do the first reading and the psalm, and then we would switch. Like I'd be standing behind him, and then I would stand in the pulpit. He would stand right behind me as I would read the second lesson at 9, 10, and 11. This is a beautiful image to me. My dad standing and literally having my back in my life of faith. My dad, who never got to see me finish seminary, never got to see me ordained, has my back as I proclaim the word of God. He is truly a saint in my life. And because of him and his influence and his instilling deep love of liturgy in me, it's part of why I'm here preaching to you now. There are saints that have gone before us. There are people who have taught us about faith. There are people who have taught us how to be better humans, how to better react to the world around us. There are people who have taught us practical things like how to read a confusing hymnal. There are people who have taught us what it means to be people who are disciples of Jesus. I would like to pause for just a moment and invite you to remember a story or a person from your own life, someone who is a saint of faith for you, someone who has taught you something important about what it means to be part of a church or what it means to believe in Jesus. When we lose these people, sometimes it can feel like our entire world is falling apart. Sometimes it can feel very much like Halloween, where things jump out at us and they're scary, or we randomly see something and burst into tears. I will tell you that I can't go into the card aisle on Father's Day still to this day, even though it's been 16 years. Something little always happens around Father's Day, and it almost feels the same as Halloween, where a ghost jumps out or a kid jumps out from behind a bush and yells, "Boo." Grief surprises us. It shows up at random times and places, and grief, moving through this process of fear and depression and doing the tasks of grief that include creating a new normal, it's hard work and it's unpleasant work. It can feel like our entire worlds are turned upside down. It can feel like nothing makes sense. A month after my dad passed away, Peter and I got married and moved to Dubai in the United Arab Emirates in the Middle East. And while I was there, I had the opportunity to lead a couple of Bible studies at the Anglican Church of England church on the book of Revelation. And you would think that with all of the fire and brimstone and destruction and the seals and the wars and all of the things that happen in that book, it would not be so comforting. But here's what I learned from studying the book of Revelation. The first thing I learned is that the anger at cancer is God's job. So while I can feel angry at cancer, and I do on a very regular basis, I can also acknowledge that in the big picture, I don't have to spend all of my emotional energy trying to get revenge on cancer, because in the end, God throws everything into the pit of fire and sulfur and burns it up. So this doesn't mean that I never feel angry at cancer still, but it does mean that I do not spend large amounts of time thinking about how terrible it is and how I have to get revenge on it. Understanding that it's God who is going to get revenge on cancer at the end of the world allowed me to let go of the overwhelming anger that could end up taking over everything. It's a transition process. The second thing that Revelation promises us is that in the end, there will be no more mourning, no more crying, no more pain, and no more weeping. And understanding that we have a future to look forward to where God removes every tear from our eyes, where there's no more mourning or crying or pain, where God's comfort completely surrounds us. That's what gave me the power to curl up in a ball and cry for how long I needed to cry. That's what gave me the power to do the grief work, because I realized that being sad, being angry, having my brain try to figure out what is a new normal like, what is my world going to be like now that I am without this person that I deeply love and was an important part of my life. It was safe to spend the time doing the grief, because God promises in our reading from Revelation today that we're going to have no more crying and no more pain at the end of time. We can use our faith to understand that it's okay to go from this process of death to life. It's okay to go from this process of Halloween where the world's turned upside down and there's tricks and there's treats and there's fear and everything seems topsy-turvy, and move on to All Saints Day. Move on to the place where we acknowledge there's no more mourning or crying or pain. Move on to the place where we say, you know what? Jesus promises in the Beatitudes, the blessed statements that we read today, that those who mourn now will get joy later. That those who are upset now, that those who are without now will eventually get joy again. And that doesn't make it all go away. That doesn't make it completely easy. That doesn't mean the transition doesn't hurt. That doesn't mean that thin places are not a hard place to be. It does mean, though, that if we're willing to go there and go into those thin places, we can move through them and come to a new place of hope and love and comfort on the other side. The world does not always have to be completely topsy-turvy, but we can have the stamina to deal with this because of the ways that the people have shown up for us. I don't know if you all know this, but there is an idea, a concept in sanctuary design. So, sanctuary is the big room where we worship in. And you might notice that the communion rail in most churches is usually 1 or 3 sides. So it goes up, over, back in some churches, or just in the front. And one of the things that they designed on purpose is that you can imagine the communion rail going back around the back of the church in the part that you can't see, and that you are communing with the saints in light. You are communing with the people who have gone before you. Every time I come to communion at the communion rail, I imagine there's an imaginary rail behind the church where my dad, whom I took communion with every Sunday for 18 years of my life, is there taking communion with me. Every time we say the Lord's Prayer in church, I sat next to him and listened to him say it for 18 years of my life every Sunday. And I imagine he is there saying it with me. I imagine as I preach and read the gospel, just like when I was a little girl, he is standing behind me with his hand on my back, encouraging me and supporting me. We can use the comfort of our faith to truly celebrate today the saints, to celebrate the ways they're part of our communion. They're part of the cloud of witnesses. They are part of the communion of saints. They are with us. They are guiding us. They have shown up for us in our faith while they were alive, and they're showing up for us even now in our faith, especially in this thin place of the year where we have more access to the lowering the barriers between this world and the next. The saints show up for us. They showed up for us then, and they're still showing up for us now, because that's the promise of our faith. The promise of our faith in Jesus is that death is never the end of the story. Death is never the end of the story. New life and resurrection is always the end of the story. And in the new life and resurrection, we get to see our loved ones again. And that gives us everything that we need to celebrate them now. Let us go into our celebration, acknowledging the saints that have gone before us, the gifts of faith and life and hope and teachings that they have given us, treasuring the memories, and honoring the communion of saints by taking communion in our service later today. Thanks be to God that we have the promise of resurrection, and that we have the promise that the saints can continue to show up for us in our shared faith in Jesus for always. Amen.